Thank you, Fede. Welcome, everyone. So beautiful to see the people pouring in, and some are sharing in the chat where you are in the world, which is also really wonderful to see, picturing us almost like a net of little points of light all around the globe here together. Thank you for joining us today for our second session on regenerative futures. We're really excited to share with you today all that we've collected in terms of the research around regenerative futures and the pathways we'll be speaking to. But first, we'll just take a moment to settle in and welcome you all. You've all come from busy lives, all that you're holding and doing and tending and offering your time to us, and we really are honored to share that with you. Take a moment to allow yourself to fully arrive, bringing your attention to your body, your breath, this present moment. We so often are rushing around and forget to just pause. So fully arrive here and know that you are welcome. Your culture is welcome. Your ethnic origin is welcome. All of the complexities that make up who you are, your histories, her stories, experiences, your ancestors, all are welcome. All the connections you bring with you, those who have made it possible for you to be here, your partner, your children, your friends, those who clear space so that you can take time to engage in calls like this, they're all welcome and honored. You're welcome here. We're giving thanks to the plants of the places that support us, that teach us, that build our bodies, to the animals, the two-leggeds, the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the crawling ones, the swimming ones. We give thanks to all of the beings, the more than human, that support us and support our work and animate the fire that brings us here. Welcoming all of life to our circle, past, present, and future, as we think about the futures we're collectively building, imagining, rebuilding, supporting, and transforming. Settle in, be welcomed, be whole, and be here. Thank you. My name's Aubrey. I am part of the Culture Hack Labs team. I'm a futurist, so I love speaking about futures, excited about our conversation today, and also hope to facilitate the Rhizome Fellowship. So really excited to see all of the interest, and those of you who are just curious, welcome. And those of you who plan to apply, welcome. We're grateful to have you here today. There's going to be 4 parts to our call. First, we're going to talk about moving beyond carbon and sort of the obsession with carbon that's been animating a lot of the narratives in the spaces we care about. We'll speak about what we call regenerative futures and this semantic framework for systemic change. That's the 5 pathways that we'll speak to, and sharing the research that's gone into that so you can understand the narrative grounding and why we speak of these 5 pathways and how we see them as really a woven web that we feel is our hypothesis around how change may happen in concert with Earth in this moment. And then we'll speak to the fellowship itself. So for those who are interested in applying, we're going to give an overview of the program and sort of, the steps to apply and what's involved in the program itself, the timeline, hopefully answer some of the questions you might be holding. And then we'll share how you apply. And that should take our full 90 minutes. We'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, please feel free to place them there, and we'll be coalescing and collecting them. And if we don't get to them all in today's call, we'll do our best to answer them in the email or the frequently asked questions. And we will be sharing out a recording. So for anyone who wants to rewatch this, there'll be a recording, and the presentation slides will be shared out as well. With that, I will pass off to my colleague Yael to begin us on the Beyond the Carbon fixation.
Thank you, Aubrey. Welcome, everyone. My name is Yael Marantz. I am the co-director for Culture Hack Labs and have been involved in this research. And so I'm really excited to be able to share it with you all today. I'm calling in from the lands of Kauai, so welcoming you all with aloha today. And so this is a body of research that we conducted last year looking at climate philanthropy and the cultural fixation on carbon as a solution to climate change. An outcome of this research is a framework that offers pathways towards regenerative futures, which we'll share. We'll share the process of the research as well as the framework. And for those of you that are applying for the fellowship, this framework will be guiding our journey together. This research was conducted in collaboration with Ma Earth, an organization creating infrastructure that enables resources to flow towards the regeneration of land, waterways, ecosystems, and communities. This gives you a snapshot for the breadth of this research. We published several reports, and they can all be found on our website. We'll share the link for that. As part of this issue, we've also featured 9 different articles from different contributors, such as the Center for Ethical Land Transition, Earth Law Center, BioFi Project, and others. So have a look at that. And as our intention today, because there is quite a lot of threads to this research, is to give you a high-level summary of the findings, walk you through the culture hack methodology that allowed us to get to the frameworks and to introduce the 5 pathways to regeneration themselves. To share more about the genesis of the research, previously Culture Hack had conducted 2 narrative research initiatives. First, in collaboration with the Transition Resource Circle on wealth as a transition pathway. This issue examined how wealth can be alchemized through philanthropy to serve liberation and regeneration to usher in post-capitalist realities. Secondly, explorations of narratives around land ownership and an intervention calling for land back to right relations. So this research sits at the intersection of wealth redistribution and land regeneration. And so it builds on these 2 bodies of work and evolves it. And so again, these different issues, these bodies of work can also be found on our website. So we'll share the links for that as well. The intention of this research is to find the pathways to liberate land, waters, ecosystems, and communities from the enclosures of capitalism and colonialism. This research highlights the systemic structures and cultural narratives that contribute to the meta crisis that we're in and offers pathways as a navigational tool for systems change. With that, I'll pass to Mehul, who'll take us through the findings of the first part of the report, looking at the carbon fixation to set the context for the rest of the research.
Thanks, Yael. As Yael was mentioning, a lot of our research started with an interrogation and a deeper understanding of the belief systems that were dominating the philanthropic landscape. And so this research project went through several iterations, and we did quite a lot of linguistic analysis and semantic analysis of the dominant paradigms of philanthropic activity. And the key thing we found is that the core of philanthropic funding was around this idea of carbon, and rooted to this concept that if we address the issue of carbon in some ways, we would address the climate crisis. But as we see on the next slide, a lot of this was based on this idea that GDP and carbon could be decoupled in all sorts of renewable energies. And many of us who work in this area of activism and advocacy know that this hasn't really proven to be the case. And so what we found is that the ecological impact of growth remains tied to resource use, revealing the limitations of focusing solely on CO2 emissions. And there's extensive research that we have in our report, which has just been shared into the chat right now, that goes into the specific details, the economic drivers, but also the actual empirical evidence that this is actually not the case. However, even given this very clear evidence that this is not true, philanthropic activity and even much advocacy work continues to reinforce this belief system of decoupling. So as we can see in this breakdown of funding from 2018 to 2022, the majority of sectors, which is like nearly 74%, reinforce technological and market-based solutions that both maintain the growth paradigm and also the claims of decoupling. And so this fundamental assertion really is kind of like at the root of everything that our report and the subsequent research found. But the way to frame this or understand this is that a lot of the funding mechanisms, a lot of the advocacy and policy work, were saying we have to maintain growth. And in that, we also maintain that we can decouple the GDP growth from carbon. And so we see a lot of funding streams here, for example, like clean electricity, carbon dioxide removal, planting new forests, etc., while ignoring the fundamental causal driver of the issues. Another just brief window, and in the report, there are quite a few examples of this, but another brief kind of window into the paradox, or let's say the performative contradiction in the whole system, is that we have climate aid from all of these countries, which is significantly lower from the forestry imports that these same countries do. A lot of this is flowing to the global north, and one of the key assertions we make in the report is that the global north not only receives financial benefits from climate aid through its private sector, but also uses aid mechanisms like carbon offsets to continue emitting CO2 domestically. So there's this fundamental paradox that it continues both within climate philanthropy and policy and advocacy work. So to give you a little bit about the method, I'll pass to Tiffany, who'll take us through the process that we went through in our.
Thanks, Mehul, and hi everyone. It's great to see you again, and welcome to all the new faces. My name is Tiffany Shakespeare, and I'm calling in from Berlin, and I'm on the research team at Culture Hack Labs. And so, yeah, as Mehul said, we're going to go into the research a little, but first we'll give you a little refresher on our method that we outlined in the last call, which is we've developed over the course of 10 plus years, a methodology to identify cultural narratives, understand their impact, and reframe these narratives for systems change. And it includes 5 steps. So ask is where we develop a point of view that sets the course for the research. And then we move on to listen, which is where we collect data, and we have various methods that we use depending on the research inquiry. Then we move on to understand, which is a step where we analyze the power structure of narratives and map the narrative space and look where we want to shift it. And then we move on to recode, where we build on linguistic analysis and reframe the narratives for systems change. And finally, we hack. So this is about narrative intervention. And the research I'm about to introduce, we really focus on the first 4 phases. So ask, listen, understand, recode. And the hack part will be the various projects co-created through the Rhizome Fellowship. So this methodology and the research findings are all shared in detail in the narrative analysis report, which I think has been shared in the chat, and we'll share it again via email. And right now we'll go through the basics, but please don't get overwhelmed because there's a lot of information and it will all start to make sense as you go through the fellowship or get more acquainted with Culture Hack Labs work. So we start with the point of view in the ask step. And the point of view sets the foundation and the goal and intention of the narrative research and informs the data collection. It's kind of like a compass that guides us. And our point of view for this narrative project articulates that land is a critical lever in the transition away from anthropocentric capitalist systems. However, there is a lack of shared frameworks of understanding and a coherence of underlying logics that are needed to build the momentum to enable this transition. So therefore, we want to support the development of shared narratives, tools, and strategies around the intention of liberating land from the enclosures of capitalism and colonialism. And by doing so, we can cultivate a cultural context in which it is possible to rematriate and regenerate land and ecosystems on a large scale. So as I mentioned, this research stops at recode, but the intervention will be the projects that you'll co-create in the fellowship, using this research as a base, but also going through this method again in order to refine your topics. So now we've moved on to how did we actually do this research? And we used a mixture of big listening, which is collecting data to understand the kind of larger macro trends and what we're hearing, but we mainly focused on small listening, in which we conducted 28 in-depth interviews across 6 key areas, which were climate justice, systems change, tech and service of life, indigenous land defenders, guardians and their allies, radical funders and post-capitalist philanthropy, and emergent autonomous democracies. And then we start the listen phase, in which we collect data. And once we've completed the data collection, the outcome of this stage is to identify narrative communities, which are really the crux of the Culture Hack Labs method. And these are groups of nodes talking to each other about a specific topic in a similar way. And when we say nodes, we really mean people or online publications or domains. They may not necessarily know each other, but they're kind of creating this narrative echo chamber. And when we talk about topics talked about in a similar way, we are talking about semantically similar. So they're using the same metaphors, frames, and languages, and they craft specific meaning around a topic. And now in this slide, you can see we move then from listen to understand, where we really get deep and analyze the narrative communities in more detail. And specifically, we do an intention network power analysis, which allows us to explore the focus or tone or geographical location of the narrative communities or attention. We also look at who are the actors, who are the voices, which ones are influential, what are the interconnections, which is network. And finally, we look at which have the most power in shaping the public discourse, which is power. And on the next slide, as part of the understand phase, we conduct a mapping process. So once narrative communities are analysed, we then move to plotting them on two spectrums of change. One is justice, one is ontology. And you may remember in our last call, we outlined our approach to narrative-led systems change, which was justice plus ontological shift. And here we're really building on that. So by plotting these communities along both the justice and ontology axis, we can visualize if you go back, Fede, thanks. We can visualize how they evolve across these spectrums and ensure we design narrative interventions that don't just stop at justice demands, but also foster a deeper ontological shift. And just quickly, justice is the x-axis, and this is about addressing injustices, for example, colonialism or structural inequities. And the spectrum moves from kind of injustice, the status quo, towards justice and transforming the system. And then the ontology axis, which is the y-axis, just quickly, ontology, a reminder, basically means the very ways we view, understand, and relate to the world. And this spectrum moves from ontologies of separation at the bottom, which is indicated through language, for example, expressing self versus other divides or human versus nature. And it moves towards ontologies of relationality, or ontologies of interbeing or interdependence. So on the next slide, it's just a little reminder of our approach, justice plus onto shift. Justice is an essential basis, but on its own, it's not enough and should truly move beyond modernity. New ontologies are essential. So in other words, new languages, beliefs, worldviews are needed to shift how we understand our place in the web of life. So let's go back to the mapping graph, and we'll bring it to life by showing you where we put the communities in this research. And we actually found 12 narrative communities, and we placed them into 3 clusters. So this graph is showing you what cluster 1. And cluster 1 sits in the lower left quadrant. So this is where justice and relational ontologies are at their very lowest. And here narratives are really around false greenwashing solutions, business as usual, development and growth agendas. The idea here is, or common narratives are, we need to continue as we are going, putting funds into green and sustainable solutions. And most of the energy or gravity in the narrative space, in the public discourse, this is around this region. So then we move to cluster 2, which are narrative communities around justice and liberation. So these sit more towards the middle. And all communities here are showing that there must be a link between socioeconomic justice and ecological justice. And for us to really attend to the climate crisis, it needs to be acknowledged the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And these 3 communities are really focused on calling out these hegemonic narratives. Then finally, we move to cluster 3, which we could maybe describe as a more catalytic cluster. because these communities are not only focused on issues of justice, but they're also saying that if we move upstream from the systems that are causing these injustices, we find worldviews where there is a disconnect from the other or from nature in this context. The meta crisis is really rooted in a crisis of relationality, or of identity, or of the relationship between self and other, if you remember what I was explaining in the previous call. And communities here include possibility models. So these are tangible examples or experiments of what alternative post-capitalist systems and land stewardship models might look like. And other communities include, which are also examples of possibility models, bioregional governance, community land trust, regenerative foodways, and indigenous lifeways. And now I'll pass you back to Mehul, who will go through the linguistic analysis in a bit more detail. Thanks, Mehul.
Thanks, Tiffany. And this might all seem a bit overwhelming, so just rest assured this is recorded, so you can go through this again in your own pace. But how we go through the Culturact method is identifying communities, which Tiffany just showed you, and then we map them on the justice plus ownership axis. Once we have the communities in their place, according to the attention, network, and power, meaning where the attention is, what the network is, and their power within the space, we then look at the underlying linguistic components of them. So there are two key ideas that we borrow from cognitive linguistics. The first one is semantic frames. And semantic frames essentially can be thought of as a meaning space. It's a domain of meaning in which certain things make sense. And so our definition is a semantic frame is a conceptual structure that organizes the roles and relationships involved in common situations or actions. And you can hold it loosely. It should make more sense as we go along, but we have whole sections on our curriculum that explain this in more detail. The second concept that we want to introduce is the idea of a conceptual metaphor. And essentially, a conceptual metaphor connects a source domain to a target domain. And these domains are usually semantic frames. So, for example, time is money. The domain of money is connected to the domain of time in this way, and that's what we call conceptual metaphors. So it's important to know that these are not actual metaphors that we use in language, but they represent deep cultural grammars that help us understand reality. So, and I'm just going to cover this briefly. Don't worry if this seems quite detailed. We do have a report that explains this in more detail, and there's also parts of our curriculum that go into this. But in this specific case, we found some really interesting metaphors or recursive cultural patterns of grammars within the narrative space. The first one was this idea that nature is an agent, that nature has agency, is alive, has rights, etc. And then the second one is that was quite important, was looking at this idea of improving from one place to another. So together, this gives us a conception of nature as something that has agency, and that the discourse needs to be in a progressive motion forward. Other things that we start to see in the discourse, and these are kind of more the more hegemonic narratives, is looking at alternatives as different parts and creating is making. So these are just I'm just giving you examples of these so you have a conception of what we mean when we talk about conceptual metaphors and semantic frames. Overall, some of the things that we found was that many of the narrative communities had proactive, future-oriented frames. And that's really important as we move forward. Some of the most prominent or significant things that we were seeing in the narrative space is that people and organizations were thinking about the space as something that needs to move in a new direction, that is progressive, that is speculative, that is involved in possibility and potential. Many of the land regeneration conversations were discussing ways to build future systems rather than solely critiquing the past. So there's this moving momentum and progression of not just talking about the past, not just critiquing the past, but also talking about new infrastructure and new ways of knowing and being. And then there were recursive frames like becoming aware, and social connection, which were emphasizing that actually what needed to happen was a relational transformation, a revolution in how we understand our relations to other things, other beings, and the more than human. So as we discuss the narrative space, a critical part of what we try to do is understand where the dominant discourse is. And we use a narrative tool, a cognitive tool called the window of discourse, which is usually one way to think of it is the gravitational center of the discourse within the narrative space. And essentially, the window of discourse just demarcates what is common sense within the narrative, what is accepted, what is not questioned, what is not challenged, but something that's just kind of the background of everyday life. And the reason this is important in narrative work is because if we can understand that, we can elicit the assumptions that this place holds, slowly shift those, challenge those, and move the window of discourse for new actions and new policies and movements. The first thing we noticed when we looked at the narrative space was the majority of the weight, the narrative gravity, remained in the bottom left-hand corner here within the discourse around carbon and the decoupling of the GDP from carbon. And within these two big groups, the one was around development and growth, where the greenwashing frame was used to say that what is needed is a spurt in development that can actually address the climate crisis. And the second one, which was using greenwashing frame to talk about how climate solutions are actually the solution to the issues. And this included, solar farms and carbon sequestration and all of these very technological solutions. So from there, we started to notice that when we talked to the people who are very embedded in practices on the ground that were looking at transformation of these spaces, they were in this upper right-hand quadrant where they were talking about bioregional governance, regenerative pathways, regenerative foodways, possibility models, and indigenous pathways. All of those communities that you see there were rooted in this fundamental cognitive developmental process of we are in a crisis of relationality. The real problem is actually not technical. The real problem is that we don't know how to relate to ourselves and we don't know how to relate to nature. And from that, we had all of these other communities. So taking this all into account, we demarcated two key vectors. And a narrative vector in our system really kind of shows the movement of awareness or a trajectory of evolution within the narrative space. And what we started to see was that there was this process of understanding that happened within the narrative space from the techno-rational perspective of the greenwashing to an understanding that liberation and justice were tied to the climate crisis. And from here, that there was a crisis in relationality. And through this, there need to be all these different interventions. So we narrowed it down into two key vectors, from greenwashing to liberation and justice, and from liberation and justice to possibility models.
Thank you, Mehul. Yeah, I'll invite you all just to take a deep breath in. I know that's a lot of information. And from all of that sense making, the next step is to create a narrative objective. And the narrative objective sets what we want the narrative to achieve. So in this case, to build a semantic framework that serves as an orienting guide and practical tool for systems change. A framework that supports communities in moving from partial solutions to justice-driven approaches and from critique to creating new systems grounded in new ways of knowing and being. So with this objective in mind, we move to our reframe. And a reframe is not the messaging or the communications, but rather a strategic cultural aim. It's a North Star that guides how stories, symbols, and meaning-making practices are mobilized to shift collective perception, behavior, and power. So what we heard emerge through the research is that there's an opportunity here to transform breakdowns into possibility. And not only that, but that these possibility models already exist. Possibility models are not abstract ideals. They are real world lived experiments in new ways of being that challenge existing systems. They model what is possible. From the research we saw, from food sovereignty movements to indigenous land practices and bioregional governance, these models are offering real-world examples of how alternative ontologies can transform breakdowns into possibilities, embodying the principles and values of the desired future within the present moment. So even within the constraints of the existing structures, they're showing us how systemic change can emerge through practice. And so this frame, possibility models, is a shift away from anthropocentric hierarchical worldviews, a departure from market-driven, rational, theoretical, siloed logic that currently defines climate strategies. And instead, possibility models advances ecological consciousness, relational worldviews, and has a focus on experimentation, radical imagination, rooted in interconnected logics that are allowing communities to engage in practices that are creating new possibilities. So to animate the frame of possibility models, we introduced the metaphor of islands of coherence to describe the localized experiments in justice, regeneration, and governance that many of the identified narrative communities are already embodying. These islands of coherence, food sovereignty movements, bioregional governance, and indigenous land practices are making the path as they walk it, offering powerful models of a future beyond our current paradigm. Complexity scientist Ilya Prigozhin, many of you are probably familiar with this quote. He observed, when a complex system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order. Similarly, these possibility models, already embodying the change through lived practice, even within the challenges of the existing system, have the capacity to shift the entire system into a higher order. So we can draw the parallels between possibility models and islands of coherence. And if we activate the lens of ecological consciousness and look to where transformation happens in nature, we can also draw on the wisdom of imaginal cells. These are specialized cells that are found in caterpillars that play a crucial role in the process of metamorphosis from caterpillar to butterfly. I'll share a little bit about this process to illustrate an important point and what has led us to the interconnection of the pathways. So the butterfly starts its incarnation as a caterpillar, which is the ultimate consumer. It eats 200 times its body weight each day before entering into a chrysalis. Within the chrysalis, caterpillar cells that have been dormant, which are scientifically called imaginal cells, start the process of creating a new form and structure. At first, these imaginal cells operate independently as single-cell organisms. But as they start to come online, they are attacked by the immune system of the caterpillar. They're seen as a foreign object. Yet they persist, forming clusters and beginning to resonate with one another. They start to share information between each other until they hit a tipping point. At this stage, they begin acting not as discrete individual cells, but as a multi-cell organism. The once caterpillar turns into an organic mush and is reconstituted as a completely different creature, the butterfly. It has no resemblance to its previous self, and its behaviors are now different too. It's transformed from a consumer to a pollinator. So I share that because this observable biological evolutionary process of transformation reveals something really important: the power of connection. Imagine just as the imaginal cells or these islands of coherence or possibility models start to connect with one another via shared resources, knowledge exchange, or cooperative networks, they carry the potential to shift the entire system, transforming what seems like isolated efforts into a broader wave of systemic change. Which brings us to the final part of the research, which is the pathways to regeneration are interwoven, which starts to explore these connecting points.
Thanks, Yael. As we move into this part of the framework, I think it's really important to just kind of recap quickly how we got here. And it seems a little compressed because we're putting in, weeks and weeks of work into this overview. Just to quickly reassert, the reason we're doing this is because this is kind of the core thematic framework for Rhizome 3. And so we're just trying to reinforce some of these ideas, and this recording will be available for you. But the way we got to these 5 pathways was identifying the narrative communities, looking at the narrative gravity and physics within the narrative space, and then identifying vectors for change. From this, we came up with the frame of possibility models, which Yael so eloquently kind of discussed with us all. And subsequent to this was this framework of 5 pathways or interconnected clusters. And this is really important because what we found in our research and from talking to all of these experts and doing our online data collection was there were many silos of very important activity that were happening, from land back decolonial imperatives to regeneration to new types of economies, but they were not working together. And the key part that we found within this whole system is that there needed to be an interconnectedness between these parts. So this framework tries to address this by providing a overarching structure to understand how all of these are connected. But from a high level, what we found were there were 5 key pathways that were interconnected and interdependent that were important to address as transition pathways. The first one was called Restoring Justice, Restoring Life, which focused on decolonization for ecological healing. The second one was Economies of Regeneration, which looked at transforming economic systems towards regeneration. The third one focused on land back to right relationship, which was focused on land distribution and new ownership models. The fourth one was around bioregional governance and community-led governance. So not just bioregional, but also community-focused governance of bioregions. And then the fifth one, which was the cultural and spiritual shifts that needed to happen at a community level, at an individual level, to truly understand the change in behavior that was needed. So if we go to the first one, the Restoring Justice, Restoring Life, this one looked at the intersection of decolonialism and indigenous custodianship and ecological restoration. So this cluster ties together social justice to ecological healing and and launches different projects and imperatives that look at this intersection as a regenerative pathway. The second one was looking at economies of regeneration. And so this was a key aspect, is in some cases we found decolonial movements, or we found land back movements, but there wasn't a fundamental shift in the underlying economic logic. And so this cluster really looks at, we need to shift economic imperatives from growth imperatives to ones of regeneration, communal benefit, etc., sustainable local economies. And this is the second pathway. The third pathway is looking at land back to right relationship. So not just land back, but also cultivating new forms of syntropic and relationships of care. The emphasis here is on land equity, redistribution of land to marginalized communities through land back initiatives, and establishing collective ownership models. The fourth pathway was talking about bioregional community governance. And so this was a very interesting emerging pathway that we found. Is there was a resurgence of bioregional governance, but also rights of nature, which focused on regions as systems that needed collective governance, in which the natural aspects of that bioregion were part of the decision making, were part of the governance process. And so this cluster addresses the failures of centralized governments and the need for justice-oriented governance systems that uplift marginalized voices. And here the focus is on creating bioregional governance where local communities make decisions about land and resource use. And finally, the fifth pathway, which may seem like the most esoteric or on the fringes, but was really about cultural and ontological shifts. And what this means is that people were having experiences, whether through the community or ritual or some sort of connection to nature, that was transpersonal. And it was through these experiences that we found that there was an actual shift, ontological shift, epistemic shift that allowed people to move in the direction of the other pathways. And so although this one seems a little esoteric or not really graspable, this was a very key lever in actioning the rest of the pathways within the system. So just briefly, and we won't go into this, if you're interested, the systems capability matrix was the emergent outcome of these pathways. And what we do is we take each pathway and break it down into these 5 key functions or dimensions. The first one was the process or practice, which is what is actually happening here, what activity is happening in this pathway. The second one is what outcomes is it striving for? The third one is what is the actual causal thing that is happening? It's doing this to achieve this goal. The fourth piece is its capacity for transforming the system. And then the fifth one is how do you evaluate the effectiveness and the efficacy of these different pathways? So I'm just going to do one example of pathway 2, just so you have an understanding of the framework. It's quite detailed, and we have a report that goes into the detail. If you're applying for the Rhizome, you should be looking at these as a way to understand which pathway you fit into and how your project will fit both into what goals it's trying to achieve, what causal mechanisms it's involved in, and the activities that you're doing. So from the economies of regeneration, the key idea here was developing local regenerative agricultural systems, promoting circular economies, shifting economic incentives from growth to different collective commons. Some of the outcomes in the system would be the creation of local economies rooted in sustainability, improved resilience, creation of alternative economic systems. And the fundamental causal process that we're looking here was moving the operation of extractive capitalism towards regenerative, localized economies. This obviously has a great transformational capacity at a local and a global level. And some of the key ways you would monitor and evaluate these changes was the development of regenerative economic initiatives and local economic stability and resilience. Given there were fluxes in global or national economic processes, there would be more resilience at the local level. So to summarize all of that, the principle here, the transition involves realigning economic incentives to reward sustainable practices, shifting economic value systems to prioritize ecosystem health and community resilience. And this pathway emphasizes the practical steps for transitioning towards local economies that support regeneration. And some examples of this that we found was regenerative agriculture projects, new food systems and networks, and economic system incentive enlightenment. So this is one example of a pathway. We have a lot of more detail into each one. And then just maybe to close before I hand over to Aubrey, the key idea here is that true land regeneration transcends just carbon focus approaches. And more importantly, it recognizes that social, economic, and cultural dimensions have to be interwoven and have to be connected. And this is kind of like the overview of the whole narrative space is to move from carbon to possibility models. We need to understand, firstly, that justice is connected. Secondly, we need to understand that we need to address the crisis of relationality to get us to the possibility models. So all of these together are what we consider to be the framework of the 5 pathways to regeneration.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mehul. We're going to take a moment just to breathe, ground, and center. So that was a lot of information. And as I was sharing with someone in the chat, you're not meant to get it all right now. So just take a moment to, if you want to close down your eyes, but just pause, feel your body, feel your feet on the floor, feel your body in the chair. Allow your breathing to slow. And just let all the words you've heard, the images you've seen kind of wash through your system, and allow those ideas, images, concepts that resonated, allow those to stick. And don't worry about having to digest it all right now. And just feeling into that space of potentiality. Like narratives, ideas are alive. There may be ones that want to nest in your system and grow their own roots, their own unique way of being within you. Let's just take 2 deep breaths in from that space of feeling centered. You can feel the center of your belly, your gut. In Hawaii, we call it the na'au. It's a seat of knowing, a place where information is born. And you connect to the cosmos. So breathing into that belly, deeply in. And letting it release. One more deep breath in. And letting that release. And then just before we go back into sharing, imagining in front of your heart space the thing you care about that brought you to this call today. What was it in the words you read or the resonance you felt that connected with the work you do and the hope you hold for the regenerative futures of planet Earth, Gaia? And just recenter yourself on that longing, that prayer, that wish, that dream. When you're ready, you can reopen your eyes, be in presence together. Thank you for that pause. I will pass over now to Andrea. I think she's just opening her microphone. And as we've shared, these slides will be shared out along with the recording. We've got the frequently asked questions, and we're available to answer questions on email as well. So, but I think what Mehul shared in that last slide really encapsulates all of the research. So if that concept is what comes through, that there's this woven, braided way in which we can address regeneration that isn't just linear, that's really what we're getting to. And then the narrative grounding is all the research that went into that hypothesis and that belief.
Thank you very much, Aubrey.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to share more information about the process itself. And it was very important for us to share with you the pathways for your regeneration, because they are going to be the framework, and Rhizome will be the action that we're going to construct. So during the process, we have some specific objectives. The first is to create shared narratives and discourses among organizations, people, with the aim of creating narratives that can flourish within the movements and can help us to shift culture. We also want to have borderless convergence and invite collaboration and organization among the diverse groups and organizations to create trans-territorial dialogues and actions, and also collaboration and co-learning. This online container and also an in-person gathering are the ones that are combining our methodology with also the expertise of narrative practitioners. We are looking to plant some seeds. So the results of the process will be that together we will prototype projects to practice culture hacking and also saw some regenerative future narratives. You will learn and systematize your own metrics to measure the narrative impact of the work during this process. And the process itself will be online sessions. Each one will last 90 minutes every 2 weeks between June and September. You will have access to the Culture Hack method and tools to learn how to design and execute narrative interventions. You will be facilitated with mentorship and peer exchange, joining this global cohort of storytellers, organizers, and also researchers. This will be a process of project incubation when you're going to develop the narrative hack with a direct impact on the community that you're working in or with. And also the in-person gathering when will be able to meet the fellows who are going to participate in this cohort to create collective strategies in Costa Rica. So full participation and aligned energy with the fellowship are required. And there is no financial cost to participate. Instead of it, we ask your focused energy, your attention during the process of the fellowship, and especially during the final phase of the implementation of your narrative hack. So you will be having more details on the website, but also we wanted to share with you some of the amazing voices of some of the previous participants of Rhizome Fellowship.
So I see myself as a bridge, connecting the world of technology with people, trying to ease the processes between the two worlds.
So I specifically work with Black, Indigenous, and groups of color as they've been returned to land and are holding title organizationally to the land.
I'm the Indigenous coordinator from BIL, who is an alliance for Black and Indigenous people who are facing climate justice, racial justice, and also are fighting against extractivism.
In phase 1, we laid the groundwork by establishing shared language and sense-making approaches while getting familiar with the Culture Hack tools.
Narratives are absolutely central to achieving a new economic paradigm. We want nature to grow. Things growing is positive, and it's become the only way we really talk about economies. So it's a very big task to change that narrative.
It is a polycrisis, it is a meta-crisis. So taking a singular approach to solving that itself is a false promise. And what's extremely potent about a rhizome, about these networks that interweave with each other, is that they rarely band together as many elements and expertise from very radically different spaces.
The story is that everything is crumbling, but it's actually a new beginning. And that's where I think narrative comes into play, because if we actually start telling stories about there's opportunity here as opposed to everything is crumbling, sometimes things have to fall apart for them to come back together.
In phase 2 is where the magic happens. We engage in a 4-month planning and hacking phase, focusing on narrative interventions linked by common themes like new economies, social justice, and climate crisis.
Youth in the climate space, particularly those that are engaged with institutional spaces, they are being co-opted. What I've been doing with this Rhizome Fellowship is to imagine a process through which we can establish a conversation around the false climate solutions.
With the big listening, the small listening, I think I had finally the time to ask different questions and see how those answers would speak with what we are doing, to rethink how we do journalism, how are we telling stories, and trying to give birth, I would say, to different sorts of stories narrated from the territories.
This concept of a narrative community that is not necessarily one group of people, but is this body of individuals who think a certain way. There's something very embedded in the Rhizome process that is very humanizing of everyone, of the voices that are coming together, because part of shifting narrative is so much understanding who your audience is, understanding what people's beliefs are and why they have them.
Finally, in phase 3, we gather together in an in-person week to reflect and refine your Culture Hack actions in real time, learning from one another's experiences within the cohort.
Having this global space has been really, really beautiful, and just being able to recognize the way that our struggles are all united, and we can all struggle together, and we can all live and have joy together too.
Becoming more connected to a global community of people who are fighting the same fight, the same struggle, but for the protection of different territories, different people, and also to realize different possibilities. It's like super important.
Thanks, Fede. So there were the beautiful voices of some of the previous participants in the cohort of 2024 fellowship. And as you heard, there were archaeology from South Africa that the process that they did during the fellowship was to identify, record, recode, and respond to the false climate solution narratives emerging online during COP29. The Center for Ethical Land Transition were tracking the experiences of elders and leaders working with practitioners of people of communities of BIPOC land reunion efforts and create resource on culturally affirming practitioner support. Agenda Propia was a process to invite narrators, journalists to co-create intercultural, collaborative journalism with indigenous communities as a way to enrich the conversation of climate change, climate crisis, and Latin American landscape. Earthrise from UK were actually working in providing some of the climate curious with living post-capitalist alternatives to move from the framing of paralysis, doom and gloom and despair into envisioning new systems and post-capitalist models. So we will share with you the presentation, and then you can follow up and read more about the other projects from the 2024 previous cohort. And I wanted to share also that the process itself of the Rhizome is guided by some principles that are very important. The first is that the local knowledge is legitimate knowledge. You are the experts in your lives and communities. We are here to facilitate some tools, some reflections, and create some cohesion between each other. We also are guided by making the radical common sense. Focus on the root causes of the system's inequalities is very important to do our narrative practice. Another principle is to turn self-criticism into rebellious actions. Go beyond the analysis paralysis, and this is important to move the solidarity and turn the structural criticism into solidarity, local actions, but also with global interactions. And those principles for us are reflected during the process of building together and collectively create a safe space by naming our space, our limits, our needs, by not allowing any kind of violence, and also having some resolving conflict through dialogue and respect. Because we know we're human, we can have different points of view, approaches, experiences, but we want to create a safe container. And also, the respect and honor our differences to dismantle systems of oppression and narrative monocultures. So we are present in this process for the others. So it's also a space for diversity and divergence. Some of the timeline. So we are today in the 2nd of May in our second open session. And we, since today, are going to open the application submission. Between the 2 and 16 of May, we invite you to fill the form and also to apply and do the application process. And we will let you know around the 6th of May if you were selected to participate in this cohort. And the fellowship will start in June 13, and it will be running between June 13 and 28 of November. We're going to see and meet each other in person between the 15th and 21st of September in Costa Rica during the presential gathering. So some important, information is that April, introduction application, May is start understanding the space. In June, August, we're going to work through recode and hack, and September and November, you're going to hack and build your own case study. The specific dates of the calls during the online sessions, the first will be in June the 12th, and we're going to be at the same time, 11 to 12:30 in CDT. We're going to do the ask and point of view and change hypothesis. Then in the June 26th, we're going to go through the listening model with big and small communities, and big listening and small listening. During July the 12th, we're going to finalize our listening model with narratives communities and the analysis of attention, network, and power. Then in July 14, we're going to move to the understand phases to talk about metaphors and frames. And then in August 7, we're going to do the movement of justice plus onto shift to start seeing the possibilities of our narrative hack. Then in August 21st, we're going to understand the window of discourse and the audiences of our narrative actions. And then in September the 4th, we're going to do the reframe and also work with the catalyst community and narrative objectives that you have been planning since the beginning. Then the in-person gathering and the hack will happen between September 15 and September 21st. We're going to be in person, arriving into Costa Rica in the beautiful installations of Pre-Birth. We're going to be during the week having an in-person space to deepen into your own models and to start creating your hack. So during the space and the in-person gathering, we're going to co-create your strategies. And then between October the 2nd and November 28th, we're going to do some online sessions to hack creation. And we're closing our sessions on November 28th. So this will be the important dates that you need to be aware. We're going to be using Signal as instant messaging and work on groups. All the calls will be on Zoom, all the sessions that will be virtual. And then we will share with you all the Culture Hack tools, learning platform, plus data processing tools that we have available. And we're going to use Google Calendar, Forms, and Portfolio to organize the documents and all your information. So some of the benefits of participating: you will be developing a narrative projects within the next 7 months with the guidance of the Culture Hack team. You will publish and measure that project and also the narrative impact of it. You are the owner of the results of your project, even though Culture Hack advises to publish in Creative Commons to allow open knowledge of culture. This is totally your decision. We will ask you to write a short case study of your project to be published. You will be part of bi-monthly learning sessions where you will learn the Culture Hack method, as well how to apply the tools with the existing skills you have for your project. You will receive 1 monthly advisory session with the team to follow up the development of your project. And then the Rhizome is a fellowship because your project will receive a scholarship for 7 months learning sessions, travel allowance, personal advisory, and access to tools and methodology. You will not receive a personal stipend, and this is important also to clarify. Some important collective agreements. We want to create this safe space. So you are agreeing on stepping in a space of diversity and divergence. No action of violence will be tolerated. Depending on the severity, it might lead to expulsion from program. And in case of any conflict, there will be mediation. Each team will choose 1 leading person for their project and 1 assisting person. Both will be present during the full length of the Rhizome and will be in the main contact with the rest of your team's project. And this doesn't apply for those who are invited as individuals. It is mandatory to each project to attend 90% of the online courses and be present at their Costa Rica gathering. In case of any absence, you will watch the recording and follow up with your Culture Hack advisors before the next meeting. And at the end of the program, each team will present their final results in their culture hacking to another in teams in the cohort, providing metrics that can help understand the narrative impact and sharing with your coworkers. At the end of the program, each team will write a short case study of their narrative project integrating the metrics for impact and narrative impact. The case study will be published in an Attribute Share Alike 4.0 international license of the Culture Hack website. So this is important to acknowledge that Culture Hack Labs is a collective. We declare ourselves anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, anti-militarist, anti-extractivist, and we want to create a space against any system of oppression that creates violence against people and planet. Nonetheless, also we acknowledge that some of us as individuals are working on dismantling our own narratives and privilege, and that's our own limit. We build this space for the voices, actions, and needs for those who are in the front lines of system change, and we will always be open to your suggestions. So thank you for sharing, for coming, and we're expecting your applications in the next week.
There's lots of really great questions in the chat, and I think Tiffany will repost the frequently asked questions. And also when you go to the application itself, there'll be a link to the frequently asked questions. And we've done our best to try to answer a lot of these, but also taking into account what you've been asking here, and we'll make sure we add anything that's not on there. So I'm going to go through the application itself, just so you're aware of what it looks like and how it feels. We go to the next slide, please, Betty. So before you apply, just make sure you've either attended or watched the recordings of these 2 calls, because we did set this up so that these are like the foundation upon which the fellowship will be built. So for those who are selected into the fellowship, we'll start kind of from the ground of assuming that you have some of this information already at least digested. Obviously, we're going to be teaching and deepening and all of that. So you don't have to be completely fluid with it, but have watched and digested the information. You can look at the Regenerative Futures issue. We had the links to those different issues in this presentation, and also they're on our website. So make sure that you've read through those and looked at that, looked at the matrix, looked at the pathways, and feel clear about those, because that will be part of your application. The FAQ, we've tried to put in there as many questions as possible, but please do email if you have other questions that aren't addressed there. We'd be happy to answer them. And then fill out the application form. By May 16th. The sooner the better. We'll sort of be accepting on a rolling basis and starting to go through them as they come in. Go ahead to the next slide. So be sure that you can commit to the full fellowship. As Andrea said, 90% of the calls, we understand life happens. Things happen that you can't foresee. But going into the fellowship, look at those dates and make sure that they work for you, so that going into it, you're in full commitment. That you can commit to coming to Costa Rica. We're only able to bring one of the team members, so the team lead will be the one that comes to Costa Rica, unless there's some reason that they can't come, in which case the alternate would come. But we expect both team members on the calls. We can only bring one to Costa Rica. Make sure you can join that time. And we're, Mexico City time, we're getting really clear on the timing because there's confusion and time zones, and daylight savings is always an issue. So we tried to tie it to a place that doesn't change when daylight savings changes. So make sure you do the time calculation for wherever you are, that your project is feasible within the scope of your work. We want this to be additive to what you do, not something that creates overwhelm. So it's actually like in the stream of what you're doing in your life, that you've attended or watched the sessions, and that you agree with our values. And we'll be doing an online call May 30, 31 if you're on the short list. So just make sure that you have those dates open to take a call. And then about you is really just, who are you? Where are you from? Where's your origin? Who do you work with? Some technical things like, do you have a passport? But really, how are you using narratives for system change already in your work or activism? And this is really about the whole of you, like your life history, your biography. It will be part of your project, but who are you? We want to understand who you are and why you're coming to this work. And then the person who will be supporting you. So we'll want to know who that is and their relation to the project. Then we're going to dive deep into your project. So we really want to prioritize projects that feel feasible within the scope of your work. So it's important that we understand who you are in the body of work that you've developed over your career and the activism you're engaged with, that you have clarity about the possible narrative impact. We know that, this is a deeply iterative process. You're going to be in this collaborative learning space. So it may shift, but where you are now, what is it that you know about the narrative you're seeking to change? And maybe you have a sense of where you want it to go. Share as much as you can about that. And just to name 2, concise answers are great. We don't need a lot of words. Concise is wonderful. That you have resonance with the pathways for regenerative futures, and that you can benefit from the fellowship. So we're going to ask for a synthesis of your project, where it's going to be taking place, and that might be the virtual realm. So you could name that as well, or if there's a certain territory or area, or it might be a couple territories, naming that. The range of dates is really when, if there's a project that's needs 5 years to curate and it's not going to launch until 2030, that's probably not a fit for the fellowship. So we're looking for things that would be able to launch in a reasonable time frame so that we can actually support the launch of your hack. Who is your main audience? So who is it that you're gearing this towards? And again, that may shift once you're in the fellowship, but a general sense of what you know that at this point. And then how does it benefit your community? What is the narrative you're seeking to shift? So this is naming the dominant narrative that you've identified that you feel is problematic and you want to systemically shift. And then what is the intended impact of your project as a result of making that shift? So if you can articulate that. Then we're going to ask you to connect your project to the pathways for regenerative futures. Just a note on funding here at the top. Everything in the fellowship, the teachings, advisory, travel costs, tools are all at no cost to you, but there's no personal stipend in addition to that. So being clear about that up front. And it's not mandatory to have funding for your hack to apply, but we will ask you if you have a sense of your budget. Just helps us to scope and understand the scope of your project and what you're seeking to do. So these questions are really deepening into your project itself and understanding which pathways resonate with your project. So making sure you're clear on those pathways, picking which ones you want to focus on. And we ask that you kind of have a main one because we're going to have the fellowship oriented around those pathways. So it's important for us to understand which pathway is your main orientation. And then you may have others that you're working on that, that other pathways that intersect with your project as well. That's great. You can share that as well. Why do you think this project has the capacity for systems change? So identifying that. How will the fellowship support the project? An estimated cost, again, doesn't have to be exact, but just so we can get a sense of the sort of scope and size of the project. Like what is it seeking to do and what is your strategy for funding? Did you use AI to support the writing of this application? There's no right answer there. We just want to know how people are using AI. So that's helpful for us. And then anything else you'd like to share? You can share with us a link if there's something that already exists about the project. That's helpful too. And again, keeping your answers concise is great. We'll be reviewing a lot of different applications, so being concise is wonderful. Someone asked if there's an idea for size scope that's desirable. Not necessarily, but for example, if you have a massive scope and no budget, that's going to be feasibility, right? So if we're thinking about feasibility, what's feasible for you in the team that you have with the budget you already have access to, so we can make sure that your hack actually launches into the world. That's our main focus, is to see that these incredible narrative research projects actually become alive in the world. So it's really about feasibility. And I think that's about all we've got. We've got your questions in the chat. I don't know, Tiffany, if there was any that really rose as common threads that we'd want to address here, but otherwise we'll be sharing the FAQ and the chat text and making sure we answer all your questions. Is there anything you feel called to share, Tiffany, that was a repeated question or something I maybe didn't answer?
Quite a few repeated questions on the relationship between the primary person and the secondary person and the idea of the team. So maybe you can go into that, and otherwise sure. I would point you all to the FAQs because a lot of your questions have been answered already, and we'll make sure we answer the rest. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tiffany. So yeah, we ask for you to identify a team lead and then a team supporting member. And the purpose of that is you're going to have an advisor assigned to your team. So we want to know, like, who's the communication point? Who's the kind of driver of this project? That's going to be the team lead. And then the supporting person will be coming to all the calls. If the team lead is out sick, they'll be able to be there and digest the information and share it back. And so in a way, it's kind of like the lead and then their supporting assistant, both working on the project, but for purposes of understanding like who we communicate with, who's kind of driving the project, who's making sure things happen, that, reports are in at the end, hack is happening, all of that. That's going to be the lead. So the person who's most able capacity-wise and deeply invested in moving the project forward would be the lead. And then their support is kind of like their wing person who's there on the side, making sure everything happens, and also like co-learning. Because what we found is when you have a co-learning environment, this is a lot to digest. So talking it through, being able to work on it together, hashing things out, it just really helps the learning process and actually embeds the work much deeper. And you may have a broader team beyond those two people. That's great. We just don't have capacity to have them all in the call. And for continuity, we ask that it be those two people who are kind of like on the project in terms of their communications and relations with our team. I think that's it. Thank you so much. Appreciate each of you deeply. All the work that you do, all the codes you're holding down on the planet right now. All of this work is so incredibly needed. Thank you, because, as things